Welcome to the Tax Professionals Podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Imagine this. You've recently been promoted or obtained a new job. You're excited and proud and want to make a positive impact in your new role. How would you go about doing this? About stepping up into and excelling in your new role? James Hovard, a listener of the podcast who has recently been promoted to Indirect Tax Associate at RSM Tenon, asked how to go about stepping up into his new role. So, in this episode, as James has requested, I will give my tips on how to do that based on my own experiences and knowledge. As you're listening to this podcast, you're probably also keen on progressing and developing your career, so towards the end of this episode, I will give a few tips on how you can go about setting yourself up for your next promotion once you've stepped up into your current role. James asked a few other great questions relating to delegation and role models, which I cover at the end of this episode. If you have any particular topics that you'd like covering, please feel free to get in touch with your request via LinkedIn or email. My email is jack@thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com. That's jack@thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com. It's always great to hear your suggestions, and it helps me to provide content which is as helpful to you as possible. Without further ado, let's get to it. The first and most important thing, in my opinion, is to understand the expectations of you in your new role. What does good look like in this role, and also what does bad look like? This may sound obvious, but if you don't know what is expected of you in your role, then how can you do a good job of it? I think this is even more important when you're being promoted from one role to another, for example, going from assistant manager to manager. There's going to be different expectations on you and different things that you need to do if you're a manager instead of an assistant manager. I'm using this example as I've recently moved from assistant manager to manager, and the expectations on me are different. I spend less time doing technical research, for example. I need to spend more time managing pieces of work. I need to spend more time managing people and delegating work down to the team. A bigger part of my role now than previously, for example, is to focus on building strong client relationships. So some of these might be seen as subtle differences, but they are differences. It's about understanding them and making sure that you're doing the new expectations. So how can you go about understanding what is expected of you? Well, the most obvious one, of course, will be your job description. Your job description will pretty much say exactly what's expected of you in your role and what you're going to be doing. If there's any confusion over your job description at all, or if you just want to find out further information, then there's definitely plenty of people that you can ask, whether that's your line manager, colleagues, someone else who's in the same role as you, HR, many people. Just ask whoever you can if you're unsure. I'm pretty sure everyone who works in tax will have some form of objectives, and they give you a pretty clear indication of what's expected of you and what you need to do. So make sure you understand your objectives. Another idea that you might find useful is observing others that have or will be doing the same job as you. This might not be possible if you're in a smaller organisation with smaller teams where there may be only one person for each role. But if you've got the luxury of having more than them and plenty of people or other people in the same role as you, then you can definitely observe what they do or maybe even ask them to. One thing to bear in mind as well is, with most roles, particularly when being promoted, the role that you're in will probably change over time and keep changing up until you're ready for that promotion, rather than it being like an instant change from one job to another where the expectations suddenly just completely change. That might happen if you're moving into a completely new role of some sort, but if you're being promoted, then that's much less likely to happen. So if that's the case, you may well already be doing exactly what is expected of you. That's pretty much been the case in all of my promotions, but definitely don't take it for granted and make sure that you do get clarification and make sure that you do understand if there are any differences, because that way you can make sure that you do meet all expectations. Related to all of this, you can probably start seeing a common theme emerging is whenever you're delegated a task or whenever you're given a task, again, make sure you understand exactly what the person delegating the task to you wants you to do. I'm really drilling home these points about understanding because there's so many cases where people will just do what they think is needed rather than trying to understand exactly what is wanted of them with a task or in a new role. So really do ask questions, make sure you understand, do not be scared to ask for clarification, do all those things. That way you'll make sure that you understand exactly what's expected of you in your role and exactly what's expected of you in relation to day-to-day tasks. And that way you can make sure that you and everyone else is happy with everything you're doing in your role. So once you understand exactly what's expected of you in your new role, then you can identify any areas that you need to work on or want to improve on. So that's going to be more important where there's a big change in your role and maybe there's things that you need to do in your new role that you've never done before. Just taking a simple example. Let's say you've never managed a person before and then suddenly you're going to become someone's line manager. That's a completely new skill that you need to learn and definitely shouldn't be taken for granted. So that would definitely be an area that you need to work on and improve on. There will be a bit of learning as you go along, but you can take a bit of a proactive approach, maybe enroll yourself on a course, see if there's any that your firm offer, or even pick up a book, watch some YouTube videos. There's lots of resources out there to learn to do that skill. But it might not always be that there's a completely new skill to learn. Maybe you're using a skill that you already have, but maybe you need to use it in a different way, or maybe you need to improve it because now it's going to be more important, say, to use one area of it. So an example that comes to mind in this case is trying to win client work, for example. In one role, maybe all you needed to do was talk to clients regularly and maybe when you're in contact with them, mention a few things that might take their interest and might benefit them. But then let's say in your new role, you've got a lot more emphasis on developing products and then going out there to try and find people who would benefit and maybe create a campaign to take that product that you've developed to market, which is something that can happen a lot in tax, especially when there's a new rule change or there's a particular area that a lot of people are finding useful at the moment. That tends to happen a lot. So hopefully you get the idea anyway that there's probably going to be areas that you can improve on, and it's about identifying those by understanding what is expected of you and then taking a bit of a proactive approach to go and develop and improve those areas that you want to get better at, particularly the ones that are going to be most beneficial in your new role. So at this point, you should hopefully understand exactly what is expected of you in your new role. So you can go through each of those expectations and understand the skills that you need to be able to do those expectations and parts of your job well. And once you understand exactly what the skills you need are, you can then self-reflect completely honestly in terms of where your skills are now and the difference between where you are now and where you need to be in order to do those tasks or that part of the role well. This can be a bit of a difficult task because maybe you don't know what you don't know in terms of the skills that you do need. So you're going to have to go out and find out exactly what those are. Again, maybe that's by asking a manager or asking someone else in the organisation or some other way. But once you've understood the skills you need and where you are now, then you can go about putting in some form of plan or thinking about exactly how you're going to improve each of your skills and make sure that you can undertake your new role extremely effectively and step up into that role. So just by way of an example for me, a big difference in expectation for me when I moved from tax assistant to tax consultant was that when writing answers to clients' queries, that I needed to take it from just being a technical answer to something that was more of a piece of advice. So I knew that that was a difference in expectation, and I knew that it was something that I was finding difficult. So I knew I needed to do something about that to become more practical, let's say, with my answers and giving it in a way that's going to be more helpful to a client rather than just giving them the correct technical answer. And so for me, the way that I went about doing that really was really looking at the way that my first drafts of things were edited when they were reviewed by someone else. Also looking at the way that, say, my manager or the partner in the team went about drafting their responses to people so I could see the differences in the way that they would approach it to how I might have approached it. So for me in this case, I did a lot of observing and also learning from feedback, which is something that I'm big on anyway. And if you haven't already seen episode 3 of the podcast, then that covers feedback and how to go about getting good feedback. Well, one of the most important things, I think, in terms of developing yourself, because it's so bespoke and it's directly just for you. There will be a link in the show notes to that episode. Once you've identified the areas that you want to or need to improve in, and you've also figured out how you're going to go about doing that, then you can either go one of two ways, depending on how much detail you want, but you can put that down into a detailed plan if you wanted to. You could just keep some rough notes on what you want to improve on and how you're going to go about doing it, or you could be completely more relaxed about it and keep it in your head if that's the way that you want to do it, but noting it down in some form is probably a good idea so that you don't forget. If you are struggling in terms of finding good resources to use, let's say whether that's a course, books, or maybe you even want a mentor, but if you're struggling to find good resources, then I am in the process of putting together a resources page on the website, which will detail some of the resources that I found the most useful, so that you can obviously use these too and use them to your benefit. So keep an eye out for that on the website. It will come live hopefully within 2020, but if not, definitely early in 2021. There'll be a resources page of all the useful things that I've used to help me progress, develop and improve at certain skills. So if you want some further guidance on how to go about identifying the skills that you need, identifying where you are now, and going about figuring out a way to get your skills to where you want them to be, then I think you'll benefit from a free course that I've created, which is now live on the website, and it will cover all of those things which I've just mentioned, which is basically identifying the skills you need, self-reflecting, deciding on your goals and aims, and then how to go about actually achieving them. A link to that will be in the show notes for this episode, and the show notes will be at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP14. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP14. And TTPP14 just stands for The Tax Professionals Podcast. Simple as that. Episode 14. You understand exactly what's expected of you, and now you also are working towards making sure that you can do exactly what's expected of you by improving your skills and everything else. So that's all great, but what do others think about how you're doing? You may already have a good idea of that, but do you actually know what others are thinking? Have you ever asked them? This is where something I rarely mention on the podcast comes into place, which is, of course, feedback. And so I think you should be getting honest feedback as often as possible, as that way you can understand other people's perception of how well you're doing and whether there's any areas that you need to be doing better on or differently, or whether you are already hitting expectations. So the only way to do that properly is to ask other people and see what they're thinking. From feedback, you can clearly understand the difference between your perception and someone else's perception, which more often than you think actually could be different to each other. Not always, obviously, but in some cases they will be. I had a good example of this from when I was giving an internal furlough presentation, where basically me and a colleague were both doing the presentation via Teams, and rather than just have one of us speaking throughout the whole thing or for an entire section, we kind of jumped in and chipped into each other and tried to fill in the gaps to make sure that the full picture was given. But from some feedback we got, which was completely different to my perception, was that could come across as confusing at times and distracting from the main point. Whereas that was completely different to my perception, which was that it would keep it interesting and more engaging. So, that's a clear example of where there was a different perception basically between me and someone else. And that will happen in lots of cases. So hopefully I'm iterating the point about understanding other people's perceptions by actually asking them and not just second guessing it. Thing is with feedback as well is it's very targeted and bespoke to you, which is not the case with doing a course necessarily, or reading a book or watching YouTube videos, because that's going to be more generic information, and feedback is going to be just for you. It's going to be what someone else has observed, and obviously in some cases you might not agree with it, but it will at least give you the opportunity then to do something with that information that you've been given. So for me, as I always say on the podcast, is that feedback is super valuable. It's one of those things that you should be getting as much as possible, and particularly in this circumstance where you want to understand whether or not you're doing a good job or meeting expectations of your job, then getting feedback is a great way to do that. So I don't want to go into too much detail about how to do this because I have got a completely separate episode which covers this in detail. But some of the ways you can go about getting good, valuable feedback from other people is to ask very specific questions and not vague and generic ones. So rather than asking, how did I do on that piece of work, you could be asking, was what I wrote clear? Was it technically correct? Was there any areas that weren't commercial or practical? Or were there any typos? Hopefully you get the idea. You can ask about things specific, and then you can also include a more general question as well at the end to see if there's anything else that the other person wants to say. I know a lot of people don't like asking for feedback. I also know that people find it difficult to give truthful, honest feedback. But by just listening and not getting defensive and just asking questions, taking on board what was said, then the person who is giving you feedback is much more likely to be open. So that's one good way to go about it, and that's directly applicable to understanding whether or not you're meeting expectations, because if someone is suggesting that maybe you're slightly off in one area, then by listening to what they're saying and taking it on board, you can then do something about it. But you don't always have to just get feedback from your direct colleagues. Maybe it could be ones in different teams, it could be people who are more senior or more junior than you. It doesn't really matter, as long as someone can have a perception of what you're doing and they might understand how you could be doing something better, then it's always going to be useful, particularly in this situation of understanding whether or not you're doing a good job or not. Don't just keep feedback to reviews, appraisals and other formal environments. You can just do it in any situation when you're on a call or when you've asked someone to review a piece of work. You could just ask them for a few points. And that way they can tell you where something was either on or off expectation. Hopefully you get the gist at this point. But if you're interested in the episode where there's much more detail about how you can go about getting good feedback and making sure you can do something useful with it, then I suggest you take a look at episode 3 of the podcast, which you can find at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP3. And that episode is entirely on feedback. You're inevitably going to come to a point where you are preparing for your next promotion or next role. Once you become competent and settled and you're doing your current job really well. And I guess that since you're listening to this podcast, at some point you are going to want to start thinking about your next role or next promotion and what you need to do to be able to obtain that. That's obviously great that you're keen and that you want to progress and develop. But just make sure that you don't get too ahead of yourself and start thinking about moving to that next role too quickly. Take time to first settle into your current role. Make sure you're doing it well. Let those skills that you need for your current role kind of mature and become better over time. And then start thinking about your next role. In the past, I've definitely been way too keen to progress quickly. It's kind of just part of my nature. But what I've come to accept is that there is always going to be an element of time when it comes to getting better and letting your skills develop. There's always going to be that time element attached to it. They are going to get better over time. They are going to get better with experiences. So my advice in that regard really is to almost enjoy the journey and enjoy the current role. But once you do get to that point where you're ready to start thinking about that next role, once you've been in your role enough time and once you've got competence at it, then you can start thinking about exactly what you need to do for your next role, if that's possible, because in some jobs there might not be the opportunity to get promoted. But in some jobs, obviously, there will be, so you can understand exactly what you need to do, which is kind of almost going through the same process that you went through to become competent and good at your current job, because you're going to have to understand what the expectations are. You're going to have to understand exactly what skills you need and what the criteria is, maybe understand the job description. And you can do all these things again by going through the same motions as you did to become good and strong at your current job. I mean, one of the biggest things when it comes to promotions is obviously thinking about how you can add more value, because that's ultimately what's going to result in a promotion, is where you can add more value to your employer. So, just have a thought about that. Maybe you have a good idea how you can go about doing that already. But that's obviously the most important thing when it comes to promotions is you need to be adding more value. So again, as with before, so once you've figured out the information, exactly what you need to do, the criteria, skills you need, etc. for that promotion or your new role, then obviously act upon that information and start creating some form of plan or action plan to go about actually achieving that. So again, it will be with courses, maybe books, YouTube videos, whatever information you can get your hands on to start learning those skills and what you need. Then you can start doing that then, because there's probably going to come a point where you're going to have to start almost demonstrating that you can do the role that you want to be promoted into, rather than be promoted into that role first and then learn how to do it. So there's going to be some point where you're going to be gradually getting closer and closer and closer to doing that role that you're going to be promoted into. So once you start doing that, that's a good way to show to your employer that you're ready for that promotion. And that's one way to get ready for it and obviously start doing a good job in that next role that you want. With some jobs, I fully appreciate that there might not be the opportunity to have a promotion, or at least not immediately, because there might be some blockages in the chain, let's say. And I know, for example, that tends to happen quite a lot at HMRC, whereas you can't be promoted into a role until a person who's already in it either leaves or retires in some form like that. So I know that happens a lot, and I imagine it also happens in in-house roles where there can only be so many people in the team, so many people in a certain job. There's only going to be one head of tax, for example. So if you're waiting to be promoted into that role, then you're going to have to either wait or move out and find that job in a different employer. But even if that's the case, you can already start developing yourself and getting your skills closer so that you're able to do that job. And obviously then when you go to job interviews, etc., you'll be able to demonstrate that you do have the qualities and you have already developed what you need to be able to do that role. And that's obviously going to make it much easier then for you to get that role. Hopefully that makes sense anyway. Some jobs are going to have those blockages. Fully appreciate that. And you're just going to have a workaround as best as possible to get around that. So I've already mentioned this earlier on in the episode, but it really is relevant for this section all about progressing and taking your career forward, is that for those of you that are keen in progressing your career, then you may be interested in this free course that I've created, which is now live on the website. And this course is basically designed to help you figure out exactly what tax job that you want in the future, so where you want to, where your end goal is, and then help you to accelerate your path of progression to that goal or job at a pace that's kind of set by you rather than others. So it will allow you to take control of your career. So the course is kind of in stages, starting right at the beginning really. So it starts with helping you to get an idea of the tax jobs which will align with your career objectives and lifestyle goals. So then you can obviously think about where you want to take your career in the long run, or maybe even the short term. So once you have an idea of that, and maybe you've got a good idea then of what you want to work towards, you will then be able to get an understanding of exactly what you need to do to be able to achieve the job of your choosing. So that will take you through the steps of identifying the skills that you will need, where you are now, and how you can go about getting your skills to a level where you need them. Once you've done all those things, the course will then help you to create your very own and bespoke professional development plan, which will be entirely yours, which will just help keep you focused and on track towards your goals and help you get there at a pace of your choosing. As mentioned earlier on in this episode, plans can obviously be as brief or as detailed as you like. It's completely down to you, but getting something down on paper of some sort will really help keep you basically focused, and it'll be something that you can use to remind yourself, especially through times where you may be finding it hard to motivate yourself, or maybe you're finding yourself a bit lost for direction. Then you can go back to your plan and you'll get you straight back on track. So that's what the course is designed to do really. It's help you understand what job you might want in the future, how to get there, documenting how to get there, or some form of plan that you're going to follow, and then basically doing it. As I say, this course is completely free, so if you would like to enroll on this course, which is delivered entirely by email over 7 days, then you can head on over to the show notes for this episode, and a link will be there. The show notes will be at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP14. So in this section, I'm just going to answer 2 really good questions that James asked when we were talking about what he would like covered in this episode. And I'm sure they're questions which you may have asked yourself before as well, and I think you'll be interested in the answers to. So the first one is kind of when it comes to delegation, should you assign a full piece of work to a single individual, or should you spread it over multiple individuals? And I'm almost going to cop out a little bit at the start of this answer by just saying that really the answer to that question depends. So it could depend on many things, such as the task size, the capacity of each individual currently within the team. So can one individual take on that full task at the moment, or have they got other tasks that they also need to complete and they might not have capacity to take that task on? Might also depend on the capabilities of people in the team. How many people in the team can get on and complete that task well? Is there only one person? Is there multiple people? And also time constraints, because if you need to get it done really quickly and no one in the team has the capacity to take that on board and do it ASAP, then you might need to spread it over multiple people. So those are some things that you might want to think about when deciding whether or not to assign a full piece of work to a single individual or spread it over multiple people. But I would just say that my preference, generally speaking, is to delegate to one person where that is possible. And that's really because there's then less time spent managing people, because there's only one person who's doing the task and you can easily communicate with that single person rather than multiple people. It means there's less people to chase up and talk to and be updated by. And it also means that the result is going to be more joined up, and it might be a bit more disjointed if there's multiple people there. It's obviously harder to get a joined up result with more people involved. But although it's my preference, there are times where delegating or spreading it to multiple people is much better. And in any event, there's always the potential for double delegation. And by that I mean, let's say you're delegated a task, and then maybe you want to delegate part of that task to another person. And that's something I like to try and avoid, because things can get lost in communication, or where there's like a chain of people passing something on. But it can work in certain circumstances, and that's a potential that could be used as well. There is a full episode on delegation. It's episode 4 of the podcast. A link to that will be in the show notes, but you can find it at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP4. So then the second question is, should you have role models? So James was basically saying that he likes to have a role model where he can see how they do things so that he can take that on board and maybe even think about ways that it could be done better by him. So that's one of the ways that he goes about progressing and developing his skills. So whilst there's no requirement to have a role model, it is something that can be really useful in helping you to learn new skills and to develop yourself. For me, personally, I tend not to have a single role model per se, but I do kind of observe and see how lots of different people do different things, and then I kind of use that to build my own unique approach to something. So let's say that there's someone that I know is really good at delegation, then I might just kind of try and understand how they go about delegation by maybe watching them and maybe even asking them some questions about what their approach might be. And then I could do that again for some different skill, maybe. But as well as being able to kind of observe what things you can do, which are good and helpful, you can also do it in the reverse, which is spot things that you think are unhelpful or bad to do, and then try and keep them out of your approach. So you can learn as much about how to do something as well as how to not do something. So hopefully that's helpful. I think role models can be really useful. And if that's something that works for you, then go ahead and do that, obviously. And if you haven't done it before, maybe give it a go. For me, observing others has always been a really useful way to learn how to do new things or to develop my skills. So in summary then, the ways you can go and step up into your new role and excel in it is to understand exactly what is expected of you in your new promotion or role. Identify any areas that you need to work on and work on them. Get honest feedback and seek it as often as possible so that you can understand where there might be some shortfalls in what is expected of you, and obviously pick up your game and make sure that you're meeting those expectations. Once you are comfortable in your current role, you can start thinking about your next role or next promotion and work towards being able to demonstrate that you meet the criteria for that new role or promotion. When it comes to delegation, there is no right or wrong answer in terms of whether you should assign a task or piece of work to a single individual or multiple people, but if you think about the situation that you have, that should help you to decide what the right answer is. And observing people or having role models in some way is going to be a useful way for you to learn and develop your skills on the job from your experiences. So thanks again to James for the suggestion for this episode, and for anyone who wants to make a positive impact in their new role or promotion, then I do hope that you find the tips given in this episode useful. The show notes can be found at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP14, and the show notes will contain links to the episodes mentioned in this episode. So that's the feedback episode and the delegation episode. And on top of that, it also includes a link to the free course that was mentioned earlier on in the episode. So if nothing else, I can highly suggest that you do enroll on that course. What have you got to lose? Because after all, it's free, and I worked really hard in packing in lots of useful information, which I believe you'll find helpful. So that's it for this episode. I hope you found the episode useful and have taken away some useful points that you can use to help improve and develop your tax career. Until next time.